It's a pretty recent one where we put 10, 11 months into it, and we were going through the diligence, and it was less than a week away from closing, and a small problem came up, and it would have been easy to just sweep it under the rug and say, hey, acquisitions have worked in the past. This looks like most of the other ones. I'm sure this is fine. It'll pan out. And we ended up pausing on that and diving in. And the more we looked into that individual problem, the more we realized that it was going to be a bad fit.
Hi, I'm Paul Giannamore. I wanted to welcome our new subscribers to the channel. You know, historically, Potomac TV has been focused on business and operational information and interviews for residential and commercial services business owners. But after the publication of the Sell-Side M&A Masterclass last month, my LinkedIn inbox has been inundated with a variety of different requests. So Dylan and I will be sitting down filming more extensive M&A masterclasses, both focusing on the sell side as well as the buy side. I intend to talk about the choice of process, delving deep into M&A psychology, as well as extensive buy side practice, approach, and due diligence. For those of you who have not subscribed, you can click below and subscribe to the channel. Furthermore, we've provided a link here in the description where you can get on our email distribution list. And if you do that, you'll receive an email right in your inbox with our latest publications. Feel free to put a comment below on the types of things you want to see. I mean, this channel is largely driven by you, the viewer, and what you want to see from us. Again, thanks for joining us here at Potomac TV.
Rob, it's great to have you.
Good to be here.
Appreciate you showing up here. I actually say this with all sincerity, you're one of my favorite people to talk to.
Well, thanks. And you're probably the only person I've talked to today, but you're definitely my favorite on any other day as well.
Awesome. I thought I'd begin the session by congratulating you. You just got an award, and I want to talk about that.
Cool. Well, thank you. Yeah, just received the Quilly Award for my book that got published last year. It's been a fun piece to have. Had a lot of commentary. It's had some interesting shifts in the business, and yeah, it's been fun.
What is a Quilly?
It's an award from the National Society of Bestsellers, and I think Nick Nanton put it together years ago just because it's one of those things where, you know, you publish a book and then you achieve some kind of bestseller element somewhere, and then it just kind of disappears behind you, and there really isn't any way to capture that. And so that's the main goal there, is to give some kind of element of recognition that can be shown and referenced and shared.
Large cash prize as well?
We actually put all of the money that came from it to charity. So that was the deal going into it, is none of us were going to make a penny off of the book. So yeah, a whole pile of no cash.
Well, in addition to the book, do you have anything else coming down the pike?
Yeah, the book did so well, and we had a lot of, you know, not just sales from it, but a lot of good conversation in our industry, in just business in general. And so we decided to use that as a springboard into a different platform. So we put together a documentary that dives deeper into the themes and topics of there, especially some of the stories that just in that small chapter I really couldn't get into a lot of depth. So there's a documentary coming out. It's going to be on Amazon. I think it's going to be hitting early 2025. That is the next piece from that.
Are you going to be in the documentary?
I am in the documentary. Chris Voss is in there. Some of the more popular contributors to that first project are highlighted in this.
So has anything interesting happened since you published that book?
Oh. Anything in the world? There's so much interesting that's happened.
But I guess what I'm saying, like anything directly related to the publishing of that book.
Yeah, I've had a lot of people reach out to me, people that I wouldn't expect, some from within the industry, some from without. But I think what has really been the most interesting to me is how it's affected our customer culture, from new customers coming in to customers that have been with us for 20 years, as well as how different team members have interpreted the messages from that book. Some of them, you can see them really take it and embrace it, and they've taken on a whole new level of trying to really connect with the customer, really find out what they need, and help them to see a larger perspective rather than just trying to get in and out. And then, of course, you're going to have the flip side of that where people are like, well, this is what I want. Won't you be empathetic and give me what I want? And then you realize, like, yeah, that's like the toddler perspective.
That wasn't the point, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Well, it sounds like you enjoyed the process. Sounds like there's some interesting, good stuff coming out of it. Do you suspect you'll write another book at some point?
I really would like to. I've started working on a couple of just starter concepts, and then I got sidetracked with the documentary. And then, as always, like, the business is the number one focus. So when there's time, that's something I'll work on, but definitely no rush. And I think right now I'm kind of in squirrel chasing nuts mode, and I get a cool idea here and I'll flesh it out a little bit and then I'll hit a dead end. But I think that's kind of the fun of that realm, is just exploring different ideas and concepts and finding people that I can bounce those ideas off of and get good feedback and figure out the next place. And if it's a dead end, it's a dead end, and eventually one will come out.
So since we caught up with you on the Boardroom Buzz, I guess, was that about a year ago? Is that right?
Probably about that, yeah.
Yeah. How's everything been on the business front?
Business front has been really good. In our northern markets, we had some really mild winters that allowed for a quick start to the season, and then we've had the pest season extend. Our growth has been back where we want it to be. We had, last year we were a little bit lower than we wanted to, and we've spiked up, and in some of our branches been able to double and triple what our goals were. Yeah. So that's been really exciting to see.
In the service industry, like in resi and commercial services, I think there's a lot of brainwaves spent on thinking about people versus systems and processes within a business. And you're a pretty deep thinker, and I would imagine you probably toil with this yourself.
Yeah, I'm a huge fan of that topic, and it's also one of my pet peeves, because I feel like most people are arguing either for systems or for people, or they'll say they're both. But I don't feel like even the both concept captures really what it is. It really needs to be viewed as a coevolution where, if you need something to put as some kind of visual object to it, I envision it being like a spiral staircase where both sides are feeding into each other, because the people that you bring in are inherently going to impact the systems that are already in place and how those systems have to evolve. If you're in more than one market, even like in Minnesota, we've got a big difference between Minneapolis and St. Paul, and how some of that culture, just from the people that you pick up from there, impact your systems. And then you look even bigger stretches like our Massachusetts branch, that's a very different culture. And so a system that I put in place in Minneapolis in 2020 and in Boston in 2020, after 4 years, they better not look like each other. They have to evolve independently to coincide with that culture, and they're going to keep impacting each other back and forth. So that's kind of how I've been seeing it and trying to treat it over the last, several years. What's been your experience? How do you respond to that?
Well, I mean, there was a raging debate here at Pest World. I remember a few days ago, even the Mexican was involved in the discussion. People were talking about people versus systems. You end up with garbage people, you end up with garbage processes anyways, because those are the people that are creating them, right?
Yeah, but look at, you can look at really easy examples like sports, where you can see somebody who was a garbage quarterback in one system, he gets picked up by the other system, and then he's an all-star. So
correct.
The books like Who, I love them. They give really good principles, but they're intended to focus on one principle, not make it the only principle. And so if you don't really consider how changing that system around that person changed what you could get out of them, it didn't entirely change that person. And also, as soon as that quarterback goes into the system, those wide receivers are having to change and adapt. And so that change is inherently affecting that system as well.
How have you, in your present business right now, what sort of things are you thinking about with regard to this whole process versus people?
I think there's a lot to think about, and every day I'm trying to look at it from a different angle, because it's real easy to get sucked into just focusing on one point and saying like, oh, this is the magic bullet, or if I perfect this element, then everything's going to be fixed. But some of the pieces I'm playing with right now are breaking down systems that we've had in place for, maybe it's a short trial system that, a new inventory system we put in. It's been running for 6 weeks. How is that in fact impacting the behavior of our team members? And then also looking at our hiring processes, who's in there, what kind of attitudes and values are we bringing in, and how are those being shaped and evolved? So one thing I'm really looking at right now is my weekly communication with our team members and trying to get feedback on that, and having that be an interactive element where it doesn't just feel like a corporate stencil piece that's going out the same every time, and actually creating engagement, and then constantly looking at our, even the main systems that our trainers are implementing out in the field, and seeing what's working, what recurring issues are we running into, and what recurring bright spots are we having that we can try and replicate in other places.
You were talking about that earlier before we got on the show today. You were talking about like an internal newsletter or something to that effect that you were toying with internally.
Yeah. I've had several different iterations of it and played around with the content, and it's got several pieces that I want to keep all linked together, and that is being relevant to the industry we're in, so that there can be small education points and small reminders that go out through the medium of story. So they're simple, fun, engaging stories that can enforce a value or a principle from our company. Some things that I've added to it are including pictures that team members send in. So this might be something that a customer sends someone in our call center, and they're supposed to identify it, and it's blurry as can be, and we can get a laugh out of it. It can be something that a technician finds that they're working on identifying, or some problem they solve for someone. So those kind of pieces are fun. And then I've been looking, especially on the last couple of weeks, trying to focus on reviews that are coming in from our clients, and especially the reviews where there's some good detail. Either they share a story, or they'll highlight a value that we embody as a team and be like, hey, look, we're doing this so well that our customers have it in their regular vocabulary now. And I think those kind of things help reinforce that it isn't just a top-down message, but it's something that the team is generating and disseminating out to everybody else.
That sounds great. Yeah, I mean, it sounds like you're going to be able to keep it from looking like a publication of the Bureau of Labor Statistics, perhaps. Right? That's your goal.
What do you do in your company as far as trying to keep everybody aligned and have a communication piece where you can have that real connection and maintain that?
Yeah, I mean, that's actually one thing that I think we've done poorly. At our firm, we try to do kind of quarterly mini retreats for a couple of days out of the office, have a business meeting, but also do a little bit of team building. And then we have an annual retreat once a year. This year next month we're doing it in Tokyo. So we've taken the team to Tokyo. And that'll be like a 5-day affair. And so we haven't been great on, we haven't done the newsletter thing. We haven't, in our business, we have a bunch of small teams, and the teams do set up like game nights and different things that they do. But no, we haven't been great with that. As you're talking about it, makes me think about what we should be doing.
It's interesting. And, your comment about not doing great, like if you hop into a team, do you feel cohesion? Do you feel like there's a connectiveness?
Yes.
So, and maybe that's a thing that I think about a lot as I listen to some of these shows, is it's easy to hear a good idea that somebody else has and think, should I be doing that? But it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to benefit it.
Right,
yeah.
Right.
It could throw your whole culture off, and then instead of them supporting each other in those groups, maybe they're more reliant on you, and it increases the burden on something that you're not actually able to achieve because you can't be there in person with them.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, we're pretty distributed. We're in multiple countries, and I think I've really tried to make it decentralized, like the local folks really kind of determine what they want to do, what sort of special perks they want. They set up their own, they've got one day a month they get together and do things. And that's not a corporate edict, right? That's not a mandate from above. That's them saying this is what we want to do. So I guess you're right as I think about it.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting thing to look at from a culture perspective, because as an international business, you're very different from a lot of the pest control companies that we're meeting with here. Like if you're in 2 towns in one state, the cultural variance just from the people and where they live is on a whole different scale, orders of magnitude off of what you are, where you're talking about, maybe a Filipino culture versus a Puerto Rican culture versus a U.S. culture, and we're going to Tokyo. So
yes,
that's a lot to blend, and if you try and blend too much, you end up with just a whitewash nothing.
Yeah, I guess I hadn't really given much thought, but you're right. We are on 3 continents. We're in North America, we're in Europe, we're in Asia, and it's very different culturally. And they kind of run it all independently.
Yeah, that's cool. So,
although I do think if I were to do a corporate newsletter, I would probably like write it in English, then put it into like Google Translate into another language, then translate it back to the English and have like a picture of the Mexican, like it's like written by Franco. Yeah. So
I think that would be perfect.
Yes.
Be the humor column in there.
Yes. You were going to say?
Yeah, I was going to ask, like, you have a lot of experience with culture. I know you've done a lot of studying and reading on it.
Yep.
And you also deal with a lot of different companies and going in, especially in our space, in the pest control space, like you've seen tons of different elements. So balancing what you've done with your team and your company and what you've seen in other places, what are the aspects of, is it, and maybe I don't even know how to ask the question, you might know better, but is it more culture, systems, or people? When you're going into companies, you're not just all telling all of them that they're 100% great and everything is peachy keen and ready to go. But there's probably a lot of companies where you give them advice and say, hey, you need to do this. And I'm assuming there's probably some companies where they take that and run with it and good things happen. And there's probably others where they stumble and fall and end up same level 12 months later, or maybe a little bit worse. What are the differences there?
Yeah, I mean, I think it kind of isn't all one thing. When I think about a business, I tend to break it down into, I think about a business from the standpoint of, okay, you've got strategy, you've got people, you've got the architecture of the business, kind of the incentive structures within, you've got the routines, which is basically the processes that kind of run the low level stuff. And then of course you have culture. And if I take my business out of it for a second and I look at, these resi and commercial service businesses across the spectrum, I've learned a few things. Number one, culture really is established in a lot of ways by the founder and the senior management team. Team members are going to model what they see the owner doing. What is acceptable behavior? Well, how does the owner act? How do we talk to each other? Well, how does the owner or the founder, how has he done that? I think there really is such a thing as like high performance cultures versus not so high performance. I think you can walk into an office and kind of get a sense of, is everyone kind of sitting around eating donuts, not doing a whole lot, magazines spewing around, versus going into an office that's clean, there's some buzz. So you can kind of get a feel for, culture is really like kind of what's the deal between the company and me, and how do we interact within this organization? And in a lot of ways, the owner said it, and so I think it's extremely important. And I think last time you and I were talking about it, I said it's kind of like marriage, right? Like everyone has a prenuptial agreement. The question is, did you write it or did the state write it, right? And it's the same thing with culture. Like every business has a culture, but was it deliberately imposed as design, or did it just something that happened over time and it's kind of rudderless? And so I think it's, for me personally, I think it's a very, very important discussion for business owners to have first with themselves, like what sort of culture do I want to have here? And then also bring their teams in and kind of determine what's acceptable behavior, like what are we striving for? How do we treat each other? What is the culture? What are our norms? How do we operate here?
Yeah, you hit on a really fine nuance that I think gets overlooked by just everyday business owners and operators, as well as some people that are experts in that realm of culture. And there are a lot of good discussions on intentionality and how much you want to sculpt and shape that culture. But as you were explaining it, you mentioned getting involved with a team and having them draw that culture out and having them build it. And I think it's real easy to fall into that trap of me thinking that, as a COO, that I need to create the culture and I'm going to make this and impose it on all the teams and tell them this is our culture and this is what you're going to become, rather than interacting with them and have it be a coevolution with that team. I think that's a really interesting point to consider and probably difficult to balance.
Yeah, I mean, for me, culture is a lot about, beliefs in general. Like if you think about a cultural difference between the United States and Italy, for example, I mean, the U.S. is a relatively optimistic country. People do believe that they can typically improve their lot in life if they work hard. Now, unfortunately, I think that's changing. But you go to a lot of European countries. You go to Italy, for example. People don't really expect to be able to do a whole lot, right? They don't expect, if they work really hard, that they're going to actually be in much better shape than anyone else. In fact, they expect the government to take care of them. And so when I think about culture, it's like almost like, what sort of beliefs do we have here? Like, you're a part of this organization. What's the future look like for you? Like, where do you want to be? And are we a group of people that are striving collectively to improve our lot in life, to help each other? And that's where, for me personally, I've seen the problem with incentives. Incentives can change a culture because you have, the difference between an individual incentive and a group incentive, right? You have a lot of individual incentives. You can kind of mold culture to be more independent and self-reliant and so on and so forth, but that could also limit cooperation amongst the team. And then on the flip side of that, you get more group incentive type setup, and then you got the freeloader problem, and why should I worry about it? So I think it's important for people when they think about culture, not only to think about beliefs and how we're going to interact and the behavior we're going to accept, but also, when you talk about the culture of a country, what are you typically talking about, right? Let me ask you that. Like, so what's the culture of, I don't know, the French? What do you think?
The French?
Yes.
Boy, that's
or
that's someone who hasn't lived in Paris like you.
Where'd you do your mission?
Santiago, Chile.
Chile. Okay.
Yeah.
Tell me about Chilean culture.
Chilean culture, it's an interesting one. I think the quickest way to sum it up is there's a very big focus on status and what you can quick grab as your status as what part you belong to, because they had a pretty dramatic shift from a communist government to a democratic one, and there's a huge disparities in the economic system there, where there's places you can go where it feels like the ritziest part of the US, and you go 5 minutes the other direction and it's poorer stuff than you're going to find anywhere in the US. And to see those people interact in the same area, they'll find different things. And so it's they have the light versus dark, that's pretty or ugly, and it's very acceptable to just state that and throw it out there. It's very related to like a German culture in that regard, just very, very frank. But yeah, that was a big thing to adapt to when I was down there.
Well, I mean, look, if you start to think about the cultures of different countries, then you can start to see the possibilities of how culture would live in a particular organization from the terms of beliefs, I believe. I mean, there's a lot of places. In Europe in general, I think one of the big differences between Europe and the United States is, like, in the U.S., people on the whole are typically not envious. I mean, I think Americans by and large celebrate success, and we celebrate the success of others. In certain European countries, the success of one individual, it's almost like it's a zero-sum game. Your success is my failure, and so it's not celebrated. So how do we celebrate success within the company and those sorts of things? So
yeah,
you can go really deep in this whole cultural topic.
Oh yeah, for sure. On that aspect with the shared, the zero sum or the shared success, do you feel that's on that continuum of like an individualistic versus collectivist culture, or do you think that's another dimension in that.
It may be. It may also be on an optimism spectrum with regard to, having a mindset of scarcity versus one of optionality and abundance.
Yeah.
Right.
So if you see it as scarce and there's only so many to be had, then it doesn't matter if you're individual or collective, there's
Yes.
still a loss to be had.
Right.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
I
that's
guess
a
I
good
didn't
point.
really think about it. That popped into my mind, but
Yeah, no, that was cool. We could continue on like the kind of discussion.
We'll get on to Fluke. I want to talk to you about the.
So, Rob, you effectively grew up with Lenny and McKay, so to speak, from a business perspective. And we all know Lenny is the door-to-door millionaire. I don't know how often he actually knocks doors nowadays, but I do know he's floating out there doing his thing. As a matter of fact, I know I owe him the introduction to his book in Audible format. I was supposed to do that before Pest World recorded, but I didn't do that. But you guys come from a business that has kind of gyrated over the years to, the business originally started on the doors. Got off the doors, did some door-to-door, made some acquisitions, grew geographically. I've known Lenny and McKay for a long time, actually longer than I've known you. But I know that you're not, and I think this is correct, you're not really big on just one modality of sales and marketing.
Yeah, very correct. And I think that I hear a lot of discussions and a lot of arguments over, especially door to door, whether it's good or it's bad. And then you'll hear other things where people are talking about this method, like it's all, Angie is where it's at, and that's where they built all their stuff. And I think there's some overconfidence or lack of humility in that to say, I figured it out. And because this worked for me yesterday or last year, it's going to be the tool that's going to continue to work in the future. As I'm going through, I'm constantly running returns on every different arm of marketing that we have and trying to be super vigilant to see when those swings come, because there's times at door to door where it can be an absolute nightmare and just really change the valuation of a company. It can really change the customer culture if you put on too many all at once. There's a lot of high costs and risks in there, but man, if you want to add some density, if you want to specifically grow with the flip of a switch, there's no better tool than that. And so being able to identify it as a more complex part of a more complex tool bag is going to yield much better results than anything else. And it's not just that. With, some of the acquisitions we've been doing, we've had some that have been great, some that we learned a lot from. And then we had one where it's a pretty recent one where we put 10, 11 months into it, and we were going through the diligence, and it was less than a week away from closing. And a small problem came up, and it would have been easy to just sweep it under the rug and say, hey, acquisitions have worked in the past. This looks like most of the other ones. I'm sure this is fine. It'll pan out. And we ended up pausing on that and diving in. And the more we looked into that individual problem, the more we realized that it was going to be a bad fit. And so it broke a lot of hearts for people that had vested interest and a lot of time spent in that with no reward or payoff or achievement in it. But pulling out of that was probably the best thing that we could have done. Obviously, I can't run the counterfactual and guarantee that, but it seems like that's the case, especially after we saw how much that small pinpoint of a problem ballooned into something else. And then right around the corner, another one turns up that we lost on before, and it didn't work out on that end, and so now we get another shot at it. So constantly trying to adjust on that game and not get too high or too low is important. Right now with the digital marketing, that's a really interesting space. There's so much going on with AI, and I have no clue how that's going to impact all of the search and all of the different aspects of that. But I know that every month I'm seeing differences in strategies that are coming out across the board. And if everybody jumps on and follows the same AI strategy, it's going to be an interesting outcome. Is then it going to favor the person who can peel back from that and apply their own brain to it? I don't know, but But even within that space, there's so many different options. There's probably 1,000 different ways that you can run a marketing program through the digital sphere. And what worked for me last year, well, what worked for me in 2018 is a train wreck now, and I had to completely revamp it. And what we have going this year is going great, but I'm not confident that I can just set it on autopilot and let it go.
Yeah, the topic of AI, I mean, how have you been thinking about that? Because, this is one that I've been thinking a lot about lately. And I'm exploring all aspects of how it'll impact our business, but I'm curious about what you're thinking in your business.
Yeah, I think the biggest focal point for me right now is how it's affecting marketing and communications, but we're playing around with it right now as far as being involved in customer service and sales and automating some of those processes, especially the ones that just really don't need human interaction, and then trying to have those switch points where it's beyond the current AI capabilities and it gets switched over seamlessly to a person. So that's been one area. Using it to find trends and pick up on where we should focus our investment on digital materials is a really good piece. I am super curious about, like right now, there's conversations going on about whether we can get AI to tell us how it's getting to the point and how we can fact check it. And I don't think that that's feasible. Like, even if we ask it to tell us how it came up with it, it's gathering millions of data points. And that's why it exists, is because it does something that we can't do. So to ask it to translate a process we can't run in our own brain, I think is a fruitless concept.
Right.
So yeah, things I'm doing to keep up on it. There's a couple of daily newsletters that I'm following to try and just, in a quick snapshot, even just try and wrap my brain around what's going on and see what pieces are coming out that we can try. We're constantly trying out new pieces. Sometimes they work, sometimes they blow up, but we put them in really controlled environments. I do think with some of the more recent advances in robotics, I can actually see, if you would have asked me 6 months ago, I would have said it's not going to impact the service side of it. But if you look at some of the different mechanical pieces that have been involved in pest control, from trap monitoring to mist away systems to, plugins for homes, it really could be a piece where that's a viable element and could have, in very specific circumstances especially, be the best possible solution for a company. What do you see on the AI front?
I mean, you've pretty much covered it I'm basically struggling with the same things. As far as the service space, there's been a lot of debate about, like, the robotics, whether that'll actually be, of course, you've got the regulatory body when it comes down to allowing robots to apply pesticides, right? So this is technology will likely dramatically outpace the regulatory regime's ability to. So there's a lot of, technology will probably get there way before the regulators will allow it. So that's a lot of open questions on that. But, I'm thinking about what you're saying here made me think about you and educating yourself. And I know you do a lot of reading. What have you focused on lately? What sort of interesting things have you read?
So there's two books that I really didn't expect them to coincide, but earlier this year I read a book called Fluke. I can't remember the subtitle. It's basically why everything's out of your control and why everything you do matters. And then I just got done reading the Life and Opinions of Jane Franklin. I don't know if you've heard of it, but are you familiar with Fluke? Let's start there.
It's a book that I've read the first chapter of. It's sitting on the stack of other half-read books. But yes, I do. It was interesting. It was an interesting intro.
Yeah. The general concept, I like how the story's put together, where there's some really good books out that cover some of the same concepts, like Determined, and it's a really sciencey approach to it. And if you're into that, it's really cool. Fluke does a good job of giving specific stories that you can follow, and you can see these things play out, like how a dropped cigarette changed the course of World War II, and really minor things that are completely out of our control. And I think this ties really nicely to some of the starting topics we were on, where it's culture, where it's trends in marketing, different tools that you're using. We only have so much that we can decide and determine. There's a lot that's outside of our control, and how we respond to those things is going to impact it. Like, we're going to have an influence on it as it influences us. And I think the interesting part of it to me is how many successes and failures are both complete flukes. Like, there was nothing that, say you had a business and a tidal wave knocked out your business. Like, you really, maybe you could have built it a different spot, but something else could have happened. Those are difficult things. And so I think about that a lot as I'm hearing advice from other companies, or I'm hearing somebody talk about how they were successful. And I wonder if they're even aware of the cigarette butts that led to their success, or if they're aware of things that are just down the road that they can't predict, and how much of it is just us filling ourselves full of fluff saying, yeah, I'm successful because of X, but I'm just a really lucky guy.
I'm curious, what's the intersection between Fluke and the other book you referenced?
So, The Life and Opinions of Jane Franklin. Benjamin Franklin we love that story because he's a bootstrap character. He's the youngest son of the youngest son of the youngest son of the youngest son. So his inheritance was a half penny, right? It was nothing. But he rose up to just be this incredible figure that had so much impact on us today. And so we can really celebrate and revere him. His youngest sister was worse off than him, but only slightly. She was the youngest daughter of that line. But they started from the same point. And where they diverge really has a lot to do with the fact that she was a woman born in the 17th century. And there were things that she couldn't influence. And so to see the letters go back and forth between them, and even the fact that we only have Benjamin's letters, we don't have Jane's, because they got tossed because she was a woman and wasn't important. Well, it's a reminder to me of just some fluke things, like maybe her dad gets pregnant half a second later and she's a guy, and maybe she would have been the Benjamin Franklin, but it's that question of how many stories untold are there out there that have the exact same formula, exact same recipe, but a different fluke element, and we don't hear the 9, we only hear the 1.
It's the exact same thing I debated in a YPO forum last week, where, I was talking to some of my forum members about the fact that YPO to a certain degree can breed overconfidence from the standpoint that, there's the availability of, look, we're with a bunch of very successful people that have taken a lot of risks. So we kind of look around and we're like, oh, this guy did this guy did that. These things all work. That's great. But it's the availability. We're seeing those guys that have actually done something, been successful, didn't fail at it. There's many more that probably had done the same thing that we're not seeing because they're not in that group, because they can't be in that group because they didn't succeed, right? And so you've got that availability heuristic, so to speak. And the debate kind of quickly moved into like how much of success or anyone's individual success in life, however they define that, is related to luck versus, it's the whole like, do you make your own luck? But clearly, the book Fluke, I think, attempts to take a look at chaos theory to a certain degree, and how much, really how much randomness exists, right? How we are the result in some things that have happened from, not because of what you did, but because you were in the right place at the right time, so to speak.
Yeah,
it's very true. You look at, you look across businesses, and I can 100% say when I see, 100 different companies, there is fluke things going on, right? Because you could arguably say, well, this CEO is far more capable than this guy, and you can create a variety of different lists, but this guy's over here killing it. Oh, but this is why, because this is what happened.
So how do you guide people, like especially from the mergers and acquisition space, because essentially we're looking at all these possible companies, and they could all be, well, they're all inherently including flukes in their process. Like it's inevitable. There is some chaos in there. But what you're looking for is the person that not only stumbles across the cigarette butt, but knows what to do with it.
Yeah.
So how do you look for or guide people in that process, or what advice would you have for us to be able to identify and separate the flukes from the others? Like, what are those pieces?
See, I don't know that you can necessarily, and I haven't finished reading that book yet, and I'll let you know when I do, but I don't know that you can necessarily plan for that. But I do think that you can actually put yourself in the best position, meaning, what I've tried to do on the Buzz and all the things that we do is try to distill down some of the core principles that you should keep in mind as you're building a business, right? At the end of the day, you're building a stream of cash flow. And so you got to break down those into all the various different elements. And, that includes strategy. And then you can further break it down into pest control. It's like, okay, well, you're selling a recurring revenue product, right? So you want to have recurring revenue. You want to actually have good pricing. Like there's all these kind of basic things. So I think, you can probably nudge yourself down the path of success by just doing a lot of things that most of the people in here aren't doing. There's probably at least half the companies here are not doing the basics right. So like if you're at least doing the fundamentals right, like you're pretty much ahead of the game, or at least you're above average.
Yeah.
But I don't know how to, when I read the first chapter of Fluke, it talked about the Secretary of War going to Japan with his wife, I think in the 1920s. They stayed in Kyoto. They loved it. So in the 40s, when the U.S. was preparing to drop the atomic bomb, Kyoto was slated number one on the list. And the war secretary appealed to the president multiple times and said, let's spare Kyoto. And he did that because he vacationed there, and it was a city that it may have been his honeymoon. I don't remember.
I think it was.
But unfortunately for the people of Hiroshima, they weren't supposed to be on the list, right? And then I think it was Nagasaki ended up getting nailed because of inclement weather. The bomber couldn't get one way, so it needed to go another way. And yeah, those are fluke events that cost hundreds of thousands of people their lives, right?
Yeah, and it's interesting that the key determiner in there was an emotional element. It was an emotional driver that caused the letters to be written, and then it was the ability of that emotion to be shared with people. And so I'm going to link in a not so related story, but see what you come up with. So my daughter loves to play Guess Who with me. And it's this game where you flip down the characters and you have to say, does your character have this characteristic? Yep. So I always play statistics. I always ask a question that eliminates 50% of people. And I beat any of my kids except for my daughter. And she does statistics twice, and then she goes off her gut and will take a high risk one. And she wins 9 times out of 10. So when my family's betting on her versus me, they bet on her because of the track record. And I think also because of some of the emotion that gets involved in that gets translated. So what I'm curious about is in what you see in the mergers and acquisitions game, how much are maybe strategics or those PE groups or some of the smaller acquirers like us that are out there, to what extent are they able to peel back and just run the statistical game versus allow themselves to get caught up on betting on the hot hand? And do you think it's better to stay with that statistic game or to reach out? Because clearly for my daughter, she wins more by going out with a hot hand, and that's your YPO guys right there. Mm-hmm. They ended up way ahead versus the safe guy.
Well, a lot of it, I think, on the institutional side comes from kind of the agency problem, where, or maybe not so much the agency problem, but it's like the risk rewards are skewed, meaning if you are part of a financial sponsor, you're investing somebody else's money. So you've got relatively high potential upside, but your potential downside is quite limited, right? So you're actually rewarded, the incentive, you're rewarded to you're rewarded sometimes to take the hot hand approach, I think, just due to the incentive structures set up. And I'm thinking about this again largely from the corporate perspective. But I would have to give a little more thought to that on the private company side.
Yeah, because if you have millions or billions of dollars to play with, you can your risk tolerance is going to vary quite a bit. Where if you need to stay within very tight margins and not blow it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So did you enjoy the book, Fluke?
I did. I thought it was a really good read. I think I really appreciate the deep dives. I really like Robert Sapolsky and how he writes, and I love those scientific connections as to how it works. But I like to balance things out where I get that story element and have more applicable things. And I think part of it really just helps me connect and share those ideas with other people, because if I read too many of the scientific books, I start droning on to people and they just get that blank stare like, you lost me. But with Fluke, I have shareable stories and we can relate with just the mention of Nagasaki and Hiroshima. You and I know where we're at. And so it's a quicker reference point than to talk about synapses and how they're connecting.
Indeed. Let me ask you what you're seeing now. There's a lot of debate here as to where the general condition of the residential customer. Do you have any, whether it be data-driven or otherwise anecdotal feel for the North American customer in pest control? Like, are you seeing demand decelerate?
So I think that's a really interesting question, because every month I'm pulling data on just the market for residential, and I'm looking at that from how much search volume is in there, what's the reported size of the industry. I'm trying to look at it from several different aspects. And there have been several months this year where there's been a year-over-year decline in the same month. And I'm obviously not dumb enough to compare like August to February. I'm looking at August to August, and I go back and I look at some of the weather and how that might have impacted it. And on months that are perceptibly the same, there's been a decline. And kind of the analysis I've been running through on it is what's causing that search volume decline or the purchase decline. And I think, and I could be totally wrong on this, but I think what's happening is the pest control industry as a whole is maturing. And companies are wising up to the fact that it's getting more and more expensive to buy a new customer. So rather than go out and buy, I'm going to invest in keeping my customers. And by doing that, the perceivable market is shrinking because people aren't leaving their companies and they're staying on for longer. And so maybe they're not seeing the price increases that would go with annual acquisitions of new customers. And so, one side of me sees, I can go in, especially in some of the markets we're in where pest control was a novelty and now it's more of a commodity. It's expected. Everybody has it. So I know that pest control is far deeper into, the workings of the economy and the country and all of that. But I think the maturation of the industry is impacting how that customer flow is occurring. And I think it's going to continue to move in that direction. So, that's just what I've seen. You've got a lot different perspective. What would you amend or add to that?
No, look, I think we're seeing it in the numbers. We're seeing, we still have the growth curve is still sloping upward, but upward at a decelerating rate.
Yeah.
And, it's hard to tangle whether that's kind of the COVID boom subsiding, whether it's what you're saying about penetration rate, so to speak, or if it's just the overall health of the consumer. Pest control has gotten expensive, right?
Yeah.
And, at some point, you got to wonder how much elasticity of demand really exists in this space. So I think it's too early to tell, but over the last 90 days, we're seeing some changes.
Yeah, and it's interesting. As you were talking, you made me think of another factor that I hadn't really looked at, but just driving into this conference center, there's a lot of new construction here, and it's not a lot of single family homes. There's a lot more units, whether it's quad or eightplexes or apartment buildings go up. And we're seeing a lot of that in my hometown where I live right now. And so as you're getting that, if you compare a residential customer to, the per capita value of an apartment complex, I think there's a higher per person spend on residential. And so the more we shift to block communities, that's going to impact the overall demand and going to shift that balance between commercial and residential as well.
Agreed. Well, listen, Rob, I appreciate you joining me here today.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Great seeing you.
It's always fun chatting with you.